You are listening to The Soul's Quiet Call, written by Akumah and voiceover by Sara. Akumah Audiobooks. Chapter 2, A Stranger in the Garden. The storm came without warning. The sky darkened, swallowing the last vestiges of the afternoon light, and within moments, the first heavy drops of rain began to splatter against the windows of Meera's shop. The wind howled outside, sending the air swirling with the promise of a downpour. Meera didn't flinch, her hands steady as she continued arranging a bouquet of lilies, the soft crunch of the stems against the cutting knife the only sound in the room. Her shop was a sanctuary, its warmth and scent a stark contrast to the raging storm just beyond the glass. The bell above the door chimed, a sound that was almost lost beneath the growl of thunder. Meera glanced up as a man stepped in, his coat drenched and clinging to his body, his dark hair matted against his forehead. He closed the door behind him with a soft click, as though trying not to disturb the stillness of the room. "Good afternoon," Meera greeted him softly, her voice barely rising above the noise of the storm. The man nodded, his eyes scanning the small shop with the curiosity of someone who had never seen anything like it. He stepped closer to the counter, shaking off the rain from his coat as he looked around. "I didn't expect such a peaceful place in the middle of this storm," he said, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Meera smiled politely, her fingers still at work on the flowers. "Nature has a way of balancing itself," she replied, her gaze flicking to the storm outside for just a moment. "Sometimes the chaos outside only makes the calm inside more noticeable." The man's dark eyes flickered toward her, an unreadable expression settling on his face. "You're right," he murmured, but there was something in his tone that suggested he wasn't just talking about the weather. There was a quiet tension in the air, one that Meera couldn't place. He wasn't just another customer seeking refuge from the storm. She could sense it, as if the very air around him held a weight, a heaviness that she couldn't decipher. "Can I help you with something?" she asked, her voice breaking the stillness between them. He paused for a moment, and Meera caught a flicker of something in his eyes, something guarded, like a man who had buried his past deep enough that it would never resurface. But that wasn't what caught her attention. It was the stillness of him, the way he stood perfectly still, like a man who was trying to make himself invisible in a room full of life. "I'm new to this town," he began, his voice calm but tinged with a subtle hesitation. "I'm a travel writer. I was hoping to find a place that could inspire me. Somewhere quiet." His eyes moved over the shelves of flowers, pausing on a particularly vibrant arrangement of roses. "And this shop, it's perfect." "Travel writer," Meera repeated softly, her fingers pausing in their work. "I see." Aarav smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "No," Meera said, her voice gentle. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need." He glanced out the window, his gaze drawn to the torrential rain, the world outside now a blur of gray. "I think I'll stay for a while. I could use a break." The storm raged on, its fury beating against the windows with relentless force. Meera returned to her flowers, but her thoughts kept drifting back to him. There was something in his presence that unsettled her, something unspoken that hovered between them like an invisible thread. The following days passed in much the same way. Aarav returned each afternoon, drenched from the rain, always with an excuse about needing flowers for his writing inspiration. At first, Meera thought it was merely an excuse, a way for him to stay in the sanctuary of her shop. But soon enough, she began to realize that there was more to his visits than simple interest in flowers. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a quiet connection that neither of them could fully explain. Each time he walked into her shop, she felt the same pull, the same curiosity that she couldn't shake. He would wander around the shop, lingering over the arrangements, as though searching for something he couldn't find. He never spoke much about his writing, but there was always a subtle sadness behind his eyes, a deep-rooted melancholy that made her want to reach out to him. But there was something else, something that disturbed her more than his sadness. When Meera looked into his eyes, she felt a void. There was no desire, no yearning, no unspoken truth lying beneath the surface as it usually was when she gazed into someone's soul. It was an unsettling emptiness, as if his heart had sealed itself off completely, hiding whatever lay deep inside. And for a woman like Meera, whose gift had always been to see the unspoken, this was a mystery that both intrigued and frustrated her. One afternoon, as Aarav lingered by the counter, flipping through a small notebook, Meera couldn't help herself. She had to ask. "Why do you come here?" she asked softly, her fingers running absent-mindedly over the edge of a vase. "For the flowers, or something else?" He looked up, his expression momentarily caught off guard. For a brief moment, their gazes met, and she saw a flicker of something behind his eyes, something fleeting and almost painful. "I come because I feel at peace here," he said slowly, as if choosing his words carefully. "And because, for the first time in a long while, I feel like I can just breathe." Meera's breath caught in her throat. There it was again, the mystery. The thing that had drawn her to him in the first place. He wasn't just seeking inspiration for his writing. He was seeking something deeper, something he couldn't articulate. And that something, whatever it was, felt like it was tied to her. She cleared her throat and smiled, trying to keep the conversation light. "I'm glad the shop gives you that," she said, her voice steady. "Sometimes, a place like this can be the only refuge from everything else." Aarav nodded, his gaze softening. "Yes," he agreed, though his eyes were distant. "Sometimes it's the only place you can feel safe." Meera's heart skipped a beat. She had been about to speak, but something stopped her. There was an intensity in his words, a vulnerability that slipped past his usual guarded exterior. He wasn't just talking about the shop. He was talking about himself. And though she couldn't see what lay beneath his surface, she could feel the weight of his unspoken pain. The bell above the door jingled again, interrupting the moment. Meera's gaze flickered toward the door, but when she turned back to Aarav, the moment was gone. He had retreated back into himself, the walls around him sealing once more. Days turned into weeks, and Aarav's visits became a part of Meera's routine. She began to notice the little things, how he would always order a single rose, never a bouquet, as though he were too weary to want anything more. Or how, when he sat in the corner of the shop, his eyes would always be on the flowers, but his mind seemed a million miles away. He never spoke much of his past, and Meera didn't ask. She had learned long ago that some people were like the flowers she worked with, beautiful, delicate, and best left untouched. Yet every time she looked into his eyes, she felt that same emptiness. The void. It wasn't like the others she had seen, the longings, the fears, the quiet hopes. It was nothingness. And that was what drew her in, deeper and deeper. What happened to someone that could erase their own desires? On one particularly stormy afternoon, as the wind whipped against the windows and the rain poured in sheets, Meera glanced at the door. She had half expected him to come, to seek the calm of her shop again. And just as she had thought, Aarav stepped inside, drenched, his coat dripping onto the floor. Without a word, he walked up to the counter, his eyes meeting hers with that same unreadable gaze. This time, she couldn't hide the question any longer. "Why won't you let me see?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Aarav froze, his hand still gripping the edge of the counter. His eyes darkened with something, defensiveness, guilt, or perhaps a mixture of both. "Because if you see," he said softly, "you'll understand why I can never stay." And with that, he turned and walked out, leaving Meera standing alone in the storm, 1,000 questions echoing in the silence he left behind. Akumah Audiobooks. Refer to the channel playlist for a better experience and close your eyes to let your imagination run wild. Subscribe.